This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 155 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, I'll share some ideas from classrooms everywhere about how to teach when everyone is scattered. Let's go back for a moment to a simpler time. Back to 2019, when you may have, quote, struggled to differentiate, when you tried to meet the needs of all students who came to you with different levels of readiness, different physical, emotional, and cognitive profiles, and who learned best under different scenarios. 2020 laughs at 2019. Teaching is much more complicated now, and you are most likely in a situation where your students are scattered in some way. It may be one or a combination of these. Maybe half your class is at home while the other half is in person, and then this switches the next day. Maybe some of your students are all virtual all the time. And also maybe even the kids you do have face-to-face have to be socially distanced and therefore can't interact the way they once could. Before, a teacher only had to worry about meeting students where they were academically, socially, and emotionally. Now you literally have to figure out a way to meet them where they are. Depending on who's running your school, you may be expected to do any number of instructional gymnastics to keep all of these students engaged and on track. While I'm not going to get into the shoulds here, because I addressed some of those in episode 149, where we talked about 9 ways teaching should be different online than face-to-face. And I also did a Facebook Live a couple of weeks ago where I did a pretty big rant about one specific remote teaching problem. So I'm not going to talk too much about all of the shoulds. What I would like to do in this episode is just curate some of the ways that teachers have solved the problem of teaching students who are literally all over the place. Before we start, I want to thank UL Explore Labs for sponsoring this episode. UL Explore Labs inspires secondary students to solve global safety and sustainability issues through science. This free online teaching resource explores battery energy and fire through 3 modules: the phenomena of thermal runaway in lithium-ion batteries, mobile phone battery supply chain and the issue of e-waste, and a fire forensics investigation unit, where students investigate how and where a kitchen fire started. UL Explore Labs invites students to exercise their reasoning skills and sparks curiosity through interactive videos, hands-on activities, and virtual self-guided lessons. Today's students are tomorrow's problem solvers for a safer, more sustainable world. Visit ulexplorelabs.org, spelled ULXPLORLABS, for these free resources. Support also comes from Teaching Channel. We all know that no teacher got the professional development training they needed to deal with 2020. Teaching Channel wants to help educators get the tools they need to support students this school year with their expert design PD courses. All of their 20-plus courses are available to anyone with a Teaching Channel subscription. They all take under 2 hours to complete. Some of their most popular courses right now include Moving Your Instruction Online, Culturally Relevant Teaching, and Fostering Family Partnerships. Teaching Channel subscribers can also watch over 1,400 classroom videos that showcase best pedagogical practices from around the country. You can find videos of every grade level and observe top teachers in hundreds of different classrooms. And Cult of Pedagogy listeners can get 30% off a monthly or yearly subscription. Visit teachingchannel.com/cult to learn more. Now, let's look at some strategies for teaching when everyone is scattered. I pulled these ideas from responses to 2 separate tweets. In the first one, I asked what was working when teaching some students in person and others at home. And the second tweet came a few weeks later, where I was asking specifically for strategies to build community among all the scattered groups. I got hundreds of responses, some of which I was still trying to digest a few hours before I wrote this. So this list is just a sampling of some of the ideas I saw repeated several times, and a few that I thought were really noteworthy. If you want to see all of the responses, go to cultofpedagogy.com, choose podcast, and go to episode 155, where you will find links to both of those tweets. I'll warn you, though, it's a lot. With so many people working on the same problem at the same time, there are a lot of ideas in many different iterations. My goal here is to pare it down to just a few that I think you can use, and I have 6 main things. One other thing before I start, for efficiency, I am going to refer to all video conferencing software as Zoom. So when you hear me say Zoom, just know that this means Google Meet, Microsoft Teams video, Skype, or whatever you're using. It's just faster if I say Zoom. Okay, so the first of the 6 different suggestions for teaching scattered is create student cohorts. This was the most frequently mentioned piece of advice from teachers doing this work, so I'm putting it first and I'm separating it from everything else. The idea is to put students into groups that span different populations. So some virtual, some face-to-face, some from different days in an A-B schedule, so that they can help each other through your course. Doing this allows students to ask each other questions and support each other at times when you're not available. It's also a way to create connections between your in-class students and those who are learning from home. Now, in some classes, these cohorts are simply contact groups, so that when students get stuck, they can get clarification or help from each other. In other cases, cohorts actually work on projects or assignments together. Another way this looks is that in classrooms where face-to-face and at-home students are participating at the same time, teachers are putting students into pairs made up of one face-to-face and one at-home learner. This arrangement gives each at-home student a designated partner to connect them to what's happening in class. For best results in any of these configurations, give students some kind of a getting to know you activity to do with their cohort or with their partner so that they can form a connection and feel more comfortable with one another. Number 2 is limit the synchronous. Many teachers are finding that synchronous instruction, where all students in class and at home are plugged in and participating in real time, needs to be very limited and used intentionally, as opposed to just recording an entire class session and expecting everyone to sit through that. Here are some ways that this principle is playing out. Some teachers are just using synchronous for a briefing and a debriefing, just to do a quick overview at the beginning of class and a quick debrief at the end, leaving the middle for asynchronous work, independent work, group work, or small group instruction with the teacher. Other teachers pointed out that they only use the synchronous time for more special things. Several teachers reported using synchronous time for things like read-alouds, readers' theater, performing Shakespeare, where parts are given to both the at-home and in-person students. So they're setting it aside for things that are more like events. Another thing that some teachers are trying are virtual bell ringers. So they're starting their synchronous time with a short pre-recorded video that gives everyone a task to do, and it reviews the day's agenda. So like a bell ringer, doing this frees up the teacher to handle administrative tasks, letting kids trickle into Zoom, giving everyone something to do until it's time to start as a group. And so as opposed to starting your virtual time with you on, quote unquote on, where you're already presenting, they're starting with a pre-recorded video to kind of get everybody settled. Another thing that people are doing with their synchronous time is they're putting everyone on Zoom. So if bandwidth allows and the activity actually fits, they're putting all of the students on the video conferencing for the synchronous part, even the face-to-face students, so that everyone is on the same playing field. And it tends to make the interaction better between the in-person kids and the the at-home kids. Of course, there were some apps and software that were mentioned, so I'll list off a couple of these. A bunch of teachers mentioned either Pear Deck or Nearpod. Both of these allow you to create and share interactive presentations with students. I think the basic idea is that it's like a PowerPoint, but that you send that to student devices and then they can sort of interact with it in different ways. So that's Pear Deck and Nearpod. Other teachers are using tools like Poll Everywhere and Mentimeter. which let you conduct real fast sort of whole class polls. You can ask everybody a question and then they can submit their answer right away, and you get results that everybody can see. And then one more I wanted to mention in this section is YoTeach. It's just YoTACH, which is, if you've been doing this for a while, you might remember Today's Meet, which was a back channel tool that I remember seeing a lot at conferences and stuff like that. It was basically just a basic chat that people could log into from the event and you could have a conversation. Well, Today's Meet just sort of disappeared about 2 years ago. YoTeach has now come along and kind of taken its place, and it does what Today's Meet did with a couple of extra cool features. It has like a drawing feature and a way that you can add images. So it's definitely worth checking out. Okay, so those are some things that can kind of spice up the synchronous time. Another couple of things to say about this number 2, about limiting your synchronous, is to put your direct instruction on video. So when teachers are talking about their synchronous instruction, a lot of them are saying, you know what, I don't do my best teaching in terms of like actually direct instruction, lecturing in a synchronous situation, like live, for example. They're finding that they're giving better instruction if they pre-record it on a well-planned video and then have students watch that the synchronous is better for other types of activities as opposed to just giving direct instruction. And the benefit of that, of course, is that students can review it and watch it, or they can also, review it later if they happen to miss something or whatever. 2 other points about the synchronous time. One is to have a backup plan. So for the kids at home, there's always the chance that their tech could just suddenly go out. So one thing that some teachers are using are choice boards, things that sort of offer a list of activities that students could do in case their technology goes out. And over on the blog post that goes with this episode, I put a link to an interesting article about choice boards from Jenny Perrott, who was actually a guest on this podcast a couple episodes ago, just about doing choice boards well, as opposed to just kind of spitting out a bunch of different things and making it all about busy work. So the last thing about this second item about limiting the synchronous is really just something to consider. This is sort of a question for you and your colleagues to be thinking about. And it's got to do with differentiating with your synchronous learning. Does every student need the same amount of synchronous learning? Most of the solutions I'm hearing related to this synchronous asynchronous question seem to be shooting for one model for everyone. But just like in the old days, it is not likely that every student needs or wants that much face-to-face time with the teacher, even the kids who are face-to-face. So maybe we could be working toward customizing the amount of synchronous instruction for every student, allowing some to work independently or through digital channels more often, while others who need more interaction can get it. Now, I don't know what that looks like, but I think it's an important question to be asking. Are we trying too hard to give synchronous to all students at the same rate or in the same amounts? And is that really the best idea? Is there a way that we could maybe be making more things optional and more things, customized? So, okay, in terms of teaching scattered, the first suggestion here was to create student cohorts. The second is to limit the time that you spend in synchronous learning. Number 3 is chunk the time. It can be tremendously helpful to break up your class period into designated chunks where some students are learning directly from the teacher, others are working in groups, and others are working independently. If you can make this structure visible and predictable for students, that's even better. So what I'm providing for you over on the website are 2 different resources that can help you start to envision what those structures could look like, because there are a lot of different options. None of these involve you just lecturing for the entire period, and that's really important. That's not something we should have been doing back when we were all in person. So it certainly is not something we should be doing right now. So the 2 resources that I have to share with you over on the website Is just an article from Catlin Tucker, who is sort of a blended learning guru, really, in the world. She has really contributed a lot to teaching in terms of how blended learning can work. And now that work has become even more important now that we are all working in hybrid situations. So she provided 3 different blended learning models that would work really well. And she's talking about it specifically in this situation. She calls these concurrent classrooms, where there's some at home and some in the classroom. And then there is another set, it's a pretty big set actually, of different structures for breaking up the time. And these come from somebody named Beth Alexander, who is the director of teaching learning at the Linden School in Toronto. She was one of the people that responded, and she basically responded by saying, here are some things I'm trying. And then she started posting all these pictures of these different structures, and they were beautiful, colorful, things that showed at any given time, here's what the teacher's doing, here's what the in-class students are doing, here's what the ones at home are doing. And it sort of shows how you can kind of toggle between the different groups to be doing different things. So there's one of them is a lab type situation. One of them is more geared for direct instruction. And so everybody that was in this Twitter thread went nuts. She got tons and tons of people saying, oh, can I have this? Can I see this? Can you send it to me? And so what I did was I took all of these different visuals and I just put them into one PDF, which you can download on my site for free. They're just there for people to try and use. So that's another one. So basically with, any of these structures, if you can get a little bit more of a plan instead of just saying, okay, we've got, 50 minutes. We're going to just, everybody do this, everybody do that. Have a visual planner of what's going to happen during all of these times. I think it's a good use of that time, and it breaks things up a little bit. One other tip for this idea of chunking: when you switch from synchronous to asynchronous, but then you're planning on coming back together synchronously, some teachers suggested that you set up an on-screen timer to let at-home kids know when the time is up for an activity. Now, if you're actually having everybody log off, then you might want to, tell them to set up an on-screen timer or something like that. But using timers in general to let everybody know when an activity is over can be helpful. Okay, so number 4 is build community intentionally. Having students in multiple locations makes it much harder to build a classroom community, but those relationships are so important for making students feel a sense of belonging and connection, especially now. So here are a couple of things that teachers shared with me that they're doing to meet this challenge. One is to reserve time to get to know each other. Actually plan that into your schedule. So as a teacher, you can get to know students, both your face-to-face and your virtual students, because those masks in face-to-face can make it harder to get to know each other too, by scheduling short one-on-one meetings with each student. To help students get to know each other, you can do icebreakers, and there's the icebreakers that I have always kind of suggested to people can also work online. And I've got a link to a place where you can learn about those and learn how to do them virtually. You can also assign students to interview each other as a class project. And then just in general, set aside some time whenever possible for non-academic conversations. These over time are going to continue to grow those relationships with your students. Another way of building community is to make using names part of your classroom norms. Several teachers mentioned this. They talked about how impactful it was when they greeted their online students by name at the start of every class period. Other people also described setting discussion norms that required students to use each other's names regularly. So using names in general is going to really, really help. Be sure that you are pronouncing your students' names correctly. Check with them, do private conversations or have them record a Flipgrid or something like that so that you get their names correctly. Another thing you can do to build community is to create communal spaces online. A couple of apps here that can be useful for that. One is called Slack. Another is Microsoft Teams, which I've talked about on the podcast before. Those are 2 great options for giving students just sort of these general spaces for online communication. Padlet is another option for either a structured or an unstructured conversation. That's just sort of a virtual bulletin board where you can post a question and have students reply with their own cards. And then another one that we've mentioned some is Parlay, which is a really robust platform for more formal discussions. And there's a lot of structures that they have set up for students to do readings and then have written discussions. And then even there are ways that you can sort of monitor like more live discussions too. So that would be one to check out for sure if discussion is sort of part of your curriculum anyway. That's called Parlay. Another idea that really struck me as just something I hadn't heard anywhere was some schools are setting up Zoom sessions for lunch buddies, where students at home just hang out and talk with students in school during lunch. Now, this to me seems like something, especially the older your students get, you may not get a large response to this kind of an opportunity. But even if there are only a few students that take you up on this, think of the social impact it could make on those kids to have that small community to visit with every day. And I'm not exactly sure what it could look like. I mean, these kids would be socially distanced and then there would be a webcam with kids at home. I'm not exactly sure. Or it could be a one-on-one thing. But it's worth it to think about how are you using that lunch and recess time to socialize kids with each other and with the kids at home. And are there some fun things that you could be doing with those Zoom sessions that would get them interacting and just having a good time together? Two other things you can do to build community. Use video. I mentioned Flipgrid a few minutes ago, which is just a very simple app where students can record quick, almost like selfie videos. And then they can get put up on this grid where everybody can watch them. This is a great tool for having students just get to know each other. One teacher mentioned using these videos to have students record short responses to the same type of prompts that would normally be given for like writing in journals or doing like daily writings or something like that. Instead, they're having them record Flipgrids and letting the kids watch these at, break times and stuff like that. And then another thing to build community is to play games. So these can be games that are content driven. We've got Kahoot and quizzes and GymKit. These are things that can be played where in-person and at-home students can be on the game at the same time. A couple people mentioned Minecraft as a really ideal platform for play and interaction. I don't have a lot of personal experience with that, but I wanted to mention it because when people mention it, they're very enthusiastic. And so if that's something that you or your students are familiar with, it could be something that you make a part of your classroom or even a side thing that students do out, at a different time. And then there's even a game that I have shared on my site called Crumple and Shoot, which I think is similar to what other people call Trashkaball, which is you answer questions, you crumple up the piece of paper, you shoot it into a trash can, and you get points. This could be played with students at home and in class, where the in-class students are the ones who are actually shooting, but they're still on teams with kids at home in terms of coming up with the answers. So we've done 4 different suggestions for teaching scattered. 1 is to create student cohorts. 2 is limit the synchronous. 3 is chunk the time. 4 is build community intentionally. And number 5 is experiment with cameras and screens. So lots of teachers mention setups that involve more than one camera and screen so that the same broadcasts can capture different things simultaneously. The number of ideas and combinations along these lines got pretty overwhelming. So I'm just going to share 3 big takeaways because everybody has different setups. But one that seemed to keep coming up was this sort of idea of 2 Zooms. So when you're broadcasting, a lot of teachers are setting up one camera to focus on themselves, like a head camera, and then another one that focuses on the board or offers a shared screen of their presentation or a document camera or even the students in the classroom. But something to where the teacher can sort of have their own designated camera and then the other stuff is on the other camera. Now, I know that you can also do like a shared screen where then your head is like this tiny little thing in the corner, which is an option. But some people seem to really like this idea of 2, I guess because then it allowed the teacher to move around and that sort of thing. So that's something to play around with in your situation. This could also involve you projecting your stuff onto your classroom screen and then doing a shared screen in the Zoom or something like that. If this is not in your wheelhouse, it would be really, really a good idea to just hook up with the people in your building who really do know this stuff well. Chances are they're going to be happy to help you and help you get things set up and teach you in a way to where you're going to be surprised how much easier it is than you thought it was. So along these same lines, I'm also hearing a lot of teachers experimenting with different microphones and headset things. Some teachers are putting Bluetooth earbuds in or wearing microphones with headsets so that they can communicate directly with the at-home learners without disrupting the in-person class. I think depending on who you are and what your setup is, this could drive some people like myself crazy to have something in my ear and then people trying to talk to me in person. So take this with a grain of salt. It's got to work for you, your personality, and your situation, but that's another idea. And then some teachers mentioned using swivel. And these are cameras that actually are like motion sensitive and will follow the sort of target that you attach them to. And they can move around to track the teacher or to follow group interactions for students or something like that. So I sort of saw some teachers mention swivel and then other teachers saying, yeah, we didn't really want the focus to be on the teacher the whole time, so we decided not to do that. So it's an option to consider if something is not working great for you. Okay, the very last suggestion for teaching scattered students is to optimize discussions. If your synchronized time includes class discussions that are supposed to include both your face-to-face and at-home learners, here are some suggestions to help make the most of that time. One that's really important is to establish norms. Many of your students are going to hold back in a discussion if they don't know what the rules are for fear of messing up in front of everybody. So be sure to establish clear norms for discussion. What should students do if they have something to say? Are there time limits on commenting? What kinds of things are appropriate to type into the chat? Should students write to each other in the chat? Should everyone stay muted or keep their microphones on? So on and so on and so on. So the clearer these guidelines are, the better your participation is likely to be with your students if they understand how they're supposed to do things. Another suggestion for discussions is to enable the chat feature in your video conferencing. Some students are never going to feel comfortable unmuting in a large group, but you'll find they're going to participate very actively if it's a written chat. So when you can offer that as an option for participation, do that. Along those same lines, it's helpful to assign a chat moderator. So have a student or another adult, if you have one, anyone but you, if you're the one who's actually conducting the discussion, to moderate the written chat in Zoom so that you don't have to multitask. So they're just there watching what's going on, maybe answering questions, maybe letting you know when somebody has a question. And then that allows you to just concentrate on sort of the larger group. You can occasionally break from the live discussion to take questions from the chat, and the person who's moderating can sort of curate those for you. Or maybe you establish norms where other students can respond to those questions in writing if they have the answer. Another way to optimize discussion is to share questions with students ahead of time. So to improve participation, especially from home, some teachers are sending questions to students ahead of time, having students turn in their responses, and then in the discussion, calling on individuals to share their responses. So, you might throw out 10 questions and then take a look at them and then say, Josie, I really like the way you responded to question 3. Would you mind sharing that with us? So that you're not just sort of randomly doing this, but, you're choosing students to share especially noteworthy responses maybe. I think this extra preparation ensures that you have a productive discussion, and it also removes some of that doubt and nervousness that students might feel about just sort of volunteering their responses or having to think of an answer on the spot. Another way to optimize discussions is to repeat questions. So when a student asks a question, repeat or rephrase the question yourself so that everyone can hear it. This practice helps anyone who didn't happen to hear it the first time, which is more likely in a hybrid situation. And finally, deal with the crickets. If lack of participation is a problem, you need to figure out the root cause, because it could be any number of things. So one of the things that I've done is to link you to a post, which also goes along with episode 128, When You Get Nothing But Crickets, which is a whole post about classrooms where students just don't participate enough. And a lot of it comes down to just the way that we organize and phrase things in our classrooms. You also, to get better participation, might try to add more structure to your discussion by using a specific strategy where students take, designated turns, like philosophical chairs. There's the TQE method. And there's also something called the discussion game that I just happened to read about today on AJ Giuliani's website. And I thought, well, this will be a good one for the post that I'm doing 2 days late. So I just went ahead and linked to that also. So links to all of these things can be found over on Cult of Pedagogy if you want to dig into those. So one last quick review. You're teaching kids who are scattered everywhere. Create student cohorts. Get them grouped in some way so that you're crossing the at-home and face-to-face boundaries. Limit the time you spend in synchronous instruction. 3, chunk that time into designated activities and make that visual for students. 4, build community intentionally. You cannot just expect that this is going to happen. You have to plan for it. 5, experiment with cameras and screens if things aren't really working great for you. And number 6, do things to optimize that discussion time if you are having class discussions. So sort of my final thought on all of this is to just remember that we are in beta. None of these ideas are really tested, researched, optimized in any way. So don't feel like this is some sort of a massive to-do list that you have to check off. If you can implement 1 or 2 strategies here that make things better for you and your students, that is a success. Probably the worst thing you can do is to try and replicate exactly what you were doing before 2020, time-wise and content-wise. That is trying to force a square peg into a round hole. And by doing that, you're just signing up for a ton of frustration. Years ago, I wrote a piece urging teachers to think of your teaching as always being in beta, which is an expression they use in the software world where they develop a new type of software, but it really hasn't been tested that much. So they say it's in beta, which means it's going to have a lot of bugs and we're still working on it. We should be thinking of teaching in a post-COVID world to be the most massive project in beta ever. It's going to be messy, but that is how humans learn and grow and adapt. So continue to experiment. Fall apart on the days when it's your turn, because everyone seems to need a turn every now and then this year. Ask students and parents for feedback. Observe other teachers when you can. And most importantly, keep giving yourself and your students grace. We are getting through this. For links to all the resources mentioned in this episode, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 155. Also, to check out my new mini course, 4 Laws of Learning, visit cultofpedagogy.com/laws, and remember to use the code LISTENER at checkout to get $5 off the course tuition. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.